Guard your doctrine, free your values. This, when I stumbled across this a few years ago and realised that this was one of the most freeing ones for me. Guard your doctrine, free your values.
So having considered our biblical values, the next question we want to explore is more of a contextual question for the cultural values of your church. This set of values is trying to answer the question, well, what do we value that is specific to our church and context? Another way of looking at this set of values is to ask the question, well, how do we do things around here?
Yeah, so these values are shared convictions that guide actions, reveal strength of your church, community, for the context you find yourself in. Now, I should give a plug. Will Mancini, who wrote the book Church Unique, is excellent on this particular area. So I've learned a lot from him in this. These values, they guide your decision making, they reveal the strengths of your church, they represent the conscious collective soul, the DNA of your church, because when you're working out what they are, they're trying to uncover the ideals that you have. They define how you do ministry. They act as filters as well for decision making, what we will and we won't do, and springboards for action. So they're this constant reminder for your church of what is important to you. What are the cultural convictions that you have? And they help release leaders within that framework as well for making good decisions in ministry.
So it sounds like you might find some of these values here scattered across other churches, but they're more distinctive and contextual for your church and your vision. What are some helpful guidelines if I'm building these from scratch? Yeah,
well, just let me give you a few. First one is recognise that in a church plant context as well, some of these are going to develop over time. You're just going to need time to get to know the people that God has given you, and sometimes your own leadership and the context you're in as well. But working through and building these values is a key exercise in articulating what kinds of things you want to shape your culture. So as you start building the church, recognise cement is very wet in church plants. I keep saying it, cement is very wet. And things will become apparent over time that you may not have expected. Values are not biblical convictions, although they're driven by them. And so they are able to develop and adjust over time. That's the first thing. Just recognise that some of these are going to develop over time. Here's the second one. Where you can, state it positively. It's not a hard and fast rule again, but where you can, state it positively. The advantage of a church plant is that you are starting from scratch. So from the start, you want to actively be working towards and articulating what do you want to be, how you want to behave, rather than what you don't want to be. It's not necessarily a position statement against what you don't want to be. So, for example, we can say we are a church that lives out gospel courage. That's the positive way to put it, rather than saying we're a church that doesn't fear failure. Now, they're both the same things. Some contexts, the latter may be right, but where you can, I think, be positive. Give people something to move forward to. Here's the third one. Guard your doctrine, free your values. This, when I stumbled across this a few years ago and realised that this was one of the most freeing ones for me. Guard your doctrine, free your values. It's so tempting in articulating your values to want to list your core doctrines. Of course, your values are informed and they're shaped by your biblical convictions, but the purpose of these cultural values is not to reinvent the Nicene Creed. It's not to reinvent the Westminster Confession. They exist and they're pretty good. You don't need to do that again. You've got them. Instead, you guard your doctrine in your doctrinal statements. And in so doing, you free up the values for your church to articulate the particulars of how you want this church, this plant to look. That's three. Here's the fourth one, last one. Be careful of having too many in this. Be careful of having too many. This is not a hard and fast rule. The number is certainly flexible. But if there is going to be things which actually shape your culture, people need to be not so bombarded by 1,000 things that they can't remember any of them. And so you just need to make sure you don't have so many that it clutters the picture, but they can actually be culture setting in that. So we're part of a Reach Australia podcast network. Check out our other podcasts, the Reach Australia podcast, the Homegrown Faith podcast, and the One Thing podcast. I said last one, but I'm going to add more. Here's
You-
just a little
you
bonus,
lied.
a bonus one for everyone who turned off. But if you stuck around, you get this little bonus one. Here you go. All right. Some values are aspirational, some are realised. You need to be careful of always having so many aspirational values that they never become realised. Now, when you plant, obviously nearly every value is aspirational at some point because you haven't had any time for anything to incubate. Aspirational values are those ones you want to bring about, but may not necessarily be values that people would observe at this point if they didn't know what to look for. Now, they're good to have aspirational values. They're worth monitoring though, because if over time these aspirational values have never moved to being realised values, there's a problem. So for example, if you've got a value, we value investing in the next generation of Christian leaders. Now, when you first plant, that might be an aspirational value, although if you can bring an apprentice on when you plant, brilliant. But at the start, it might be an aspirational value. If that was still an aspirational value 15 years in, you've got to say, actually, we haven't taken that value seriously, have you? If we haven't raised up any leaders, and there's no evidence that we're committed to doing that, you know, it's virtue signalling at that point. It's pointless. You know, another one, we're theologically driven in everything we do. That is a value that should be evident in the life of your church from the get-go. That's not aspirational, that's a realised value. Everything, if that's your value, from main gatherings to meetings to how we talk to people, everything. Now, so just to say, so building values, if you've got too many aspirational goals, you may end up in a situation where people become cynical about these values altogether. So you can have aspirational goals, not too many, and make sure you're moving towards them being realised.
Okay, so we've got some examples to put a bit of flesh on this, and some you've mentioned. So we're theologically driven in everything we do. We want to raise up the next generation of leaders for our mission here and throughout the world. We believe that teamwork will produce better outcomes than working alone. And lastly, we go out of our way to listen, communicate, support and celebrate what God is doing through one another so that each person and their contribution in ministry is held in high regard.
Now you had another one, we were talking before about this, and there was someone, one of your friends mentioned, someone you admire greatly. What was the value at their church?
A friend, my dad. He's my friend. At MBM they have, we don't do pretend. And that is a negative though, so it's a little, it's said in the negative, but that comes out through the sermons and through confessing sin and being genuine about where you're at in your faith.
So the reason I'm okay with that being in the negative is because I suppose the alternative might be something like we do authentic, but authentic is such a loaded word as well that actually putting in the negative is really helpful in that context. So you can see contextually it works really well, and it highlights something that is deeply biblical, but which is deeply valued in that community as well. It's excellent. Now, those examples people will listen to and think, yes, no, that's fine. The whole thing about this is you need to work out for your context what you would choose. They're meant to be distinctive. They're meant to be personal to you and your context and your church.
All right, so take some time now to begin to pencil down the cultural values that you want to nurture in your church plan and whether they're aspirational or realistic from the beginning. For both of these values, begin identifying how the value will shape the culture of your church. What will it look like for how you speak about what you do, for what you actually decide to do, and what you'll choose not to do as a result. That's it.
You didn't end on etc. Why did I end on etc. there?
etc.